All right, welcome back to QCFV, Queer Christian Family Values Podcast. My name is Alex, your host, and we have a special guest today, Andrew Cox, and he's going to do a little bit of an introduction, and we're going to talk about letters from Paul, specifically the inclusion ministry, all that fun stuff. So we're going to go ahead and get started. All right, Andrew. Go right ahead.
Yeah.
Introduce yourself.
No, you go first. No, I'll go first. No, it's like double Dutch. I'll jump in here in a second. No. My name's Andrew Cox. I work in Johnson City, Tennessee. Let's forget that. I'm going to fix this. My name's Andrew Cox. I live in Elizabethton, Tennessee, with my wife, Chanley, and my daughter, Maisie. My daughter's 3.5. And I'm an ordained minister who in the future is looking to plant a church. And I would consider myself someone who is a progressive Christian, or someone with liberal leanings as a Christian. And so I do a lot of talks about a new lens about how you can read the Bible.
Sounds good. So cool thing is, like, Andrew and I, we've had a connection on Facebook for a while. I think you've met my pastor for coffee.
Yeah, I heard there's this Holiness Church gay guy who is I was just like, wait a minute.
Yeah.
Wait a minute. So, because like when I think Holiness Church, I think a lot of things, but I don't think a gay pastor, you know?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so I was just like, I got to talk to this guy. I got to talk to him. I want to get to know him. I'd love to attend his church. I haven't visited yet. That's on me. You invited me. Hey, all y'all need to know that if you get on Alex's radar, he is going to invite you to church every time he turns around. Right. He will. And he does it in a great way, you know?
It's like, hey, come on.
It's never a Judgment House thing. I don't know if you've ever been to that. Oh my gosh. Have you ever been to one of those?
Like, where you're basically, you feel like they're going to come to your house and drag you out if you don't come one day, or they'll stalk you in a sense.
Yeah, there's something like it involves and there's usually a turn or burn thing going on there. Yeah, we're not.
No.
Alex does it great. Visit his church. They're awesome at Landmark. But yeah, so I met him for coffee. That was great. It was a lot of fun. How else would we have known each other? I mean, I've been around the PFLAG scene.
I think that's what it is, because I used to be the president of the PFLAG Tri-Cities several years ago, before the new board took over. And so maybe we met through that. Who knows? I don't know. It's a small area.
Oh yeah. I'd like to say I'm their unofficial chaplain. I'm the unofficial. If you ask April, I'm sure April will see this at some point. I'm the unofficial chaplain for PFLAG. So
that's not a bad thing. So, but yeah, so we were talking, and you were originally going to do a podcast, and that ended up not happening. And so we decided that why not invite you on as a guest, and we'll just kind of see where that goes. And we really got talking earlier today, like an hour and a half conversation, that we were like, okay, well, let's just record some stuff, I guess. So today we're going to be talking about the inclusion ministry, specifically with Paul and all that. So I guess to start things off, like, whenever you talk about inclusion ministry, kind of explain what that is, and then I guess we can dive into some scripture and what that can look like when we're looking at the Bible.
Yeah, absolutely. But first, before you talk about inclusion ministry of Paul, you have to talk about why that's even worth mentioning. You know, because when you think about Paul doesn't usually seem like the person that you go to for, oh my goodness, he just seems so open to all different types of people. And that's usually not people's go-to, especially in like progressive and queer communities. They don't look at Paul and go, oh man, I feel affirmed. Not usually. You know what I mean? Like, let's just, take the cat out of the bag. Whenever people talk about why women should not speak in church as a pastor, they usually talk about one of Paul's writings. Or when people talk about why maybe women shouldn't speak at all, they usually talk about Paul's writings. When people talk about homosexuality in the New Testament, they tend to talk about Paul's writings. So when you look at the writings of Paul, people don't feel an inclusion ministry. They often feel an exclusion ministry.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I mean, I've had instances where people are like, well, Paul said, and I'm just like, okay.
Exactly. Because like when you encounter Paul, and it's really not when you encounter Paul, when you encounter people who have read Paul and talk a lot about Paul, they usually don't always look like Jesus to you.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? I'm just gonna throw it out because it's usually about, yeah, but what about the rules? And it's like, well, Christianity is not a moral religion. It's not a religion of appeasing an angry God. It's a way of being.
Yeah, like the
And
checkbox kind of theology of if you don't fit and do XYZ, then you're not a Christian.
right, Paul would have problems with that theology.
Mhm. Hmm.
So the first thing I'd like to say is the reason talking about Paul as an inclusion ministry is because, frankly, we read Paul incorrectly. We tend to. We
Hmm.
read Paul from a lens of moral superiority and needing to be better, while also occasionally having these really strong passages about grace. And so it's like theology by Sybil. It's like he's all over the place.
Yeah.
And it's like he talked a lot about grace, and then he said something about how homosexuals don't have a shot or something, and he never actually says that. Spoilers, but
Yeah.
read it yourself. But he never says that, and so I think we need to readdress Paul, and the way that we readdress Paul is just teaching people how to read a Pauline letter. We teach people how to read it and why to read it in a certain way and the formula that Paul writes letters. And the next thing that ends up happening is people get this rich theology and the way of being from the church that we missed because of how we were taught to read it before.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Totally. So like whenever you're going in and you're going to, teach people how to read these letters, like what is your starting point in regards to, I guess when you're like, is there a particular letter that you always go to or particular
Mhm.
passages? So walk me through that.
Yeah. So, how can I say this? When you start reading Paul's letters, the first thing you need to realize is it's not a letter, it's a speech.
Okay, that's good. That's a good point.
Yeah, well, and here's why. The Roman world had like a 4% literacy. And so a lot of us pick up the Bible and think that the way it was written was to be read. It was actually written to be heard, to be
Ah,
spoken. Um, so what would happen is this, and it was a stringent process. We know exactly what happened. Whenever a letter was written in this era, it was written the exact same way every time. It was written the exact same way. This is what happened every time.
okay.
Um, Someone would have a scribe, and that scribe would write down everything you say. And so you'd perform the letter yourself. You'd perform it, and you'd be able to stand over their shoulder and go, no, write it like this because I'm angry. Make a note there. That's important. Make sure they know I'm pissed. And and so and then what would happen is that scribe would take the letter and
Yeah.
take it away and memorize it.
Okay.
And then that scribe would come back and perform the letter for the person for whom they wrote.
Oh, so it's the scribe. So it's not necessarily like the person that's going to go out and like give the letter. It's a scribe or whoever, like a messenger that's performing it
Right.
versus
And usually the
okay.
scribe ends up being the performer because they're the one that's been introduced to the literature. So like today you outsource IT stuff, right?
Yeah. Mhm.
Because it's this other language that people don't seem to understand. So you invite someone in, they learn code, they write code, they fix something within your computer, whether it be software or a website or whatever, and you're usually dealing with like one person or a company that's well communicating, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Scribes are the same ways. Scribes are often in this situation performers. They can write, that means they can read, so they'd be performing the letter to the people so that it can be understood.
Hmm. Wow. I honestly like whenever I've read the letters, or at least the way that I feel like I've been introduced to Paul's letters is just you read them as letters, and just as though I write a letter to my grandma and she reads it kind of thing, versus an
Right.
actual performance. Like I never knew that it would be that at all.
Right. Well, it's because we're so disconnected from illiteracy.
Hmm.
We're just so disconnected from the way of life of the first century. And this isn't an argument of to be biblical, we got to stop that reading. That's not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is when you realize that this letter that you're reading, when it was originally consumed by its audience,
Yeah.
it was being heard by the entire congregation for the first time.
Yeah. Hmm.
And so that changes what you see, and it changes what you think about. And so Paul would send these people, these scribes, out to perform these letters. Now, there's one exception to that, and it's such a big exception, Paul makes a note of it in the letter itself, and that's in Galatians. He says, "See, I am writing this with my own hand."
Mm.
Now, why would that be a big deal if you always write everything with your own hand?
Yeah. Very true.
And so, he's going, "I need y'all to know that I'm so pissed at what you're doing. I didn't have time to outsource it. This was an 11 p.m. Facebook post, and you needed to
I'm
know."
raging right now.
That's exactly right. He's like, "I'm so mad that it's like get Tychicus in here. Screw it. I'm just gonna do this right now."
Yeah.
Circumcision. What are you thinking? And so that's what. For those of you that don't know what I'm talking about, read Galatians. It has a lot to do with circumcision. That is in some way still relevant today. It's a context thing.
Mm-hmm.
Check it out. But yeah.
And honestly, Galatians is like one of my favorite just because it's like you can see like the passion behind in the letter. Like you can tell like dude is just livid and and so like it's very straightforward that he's like PO'd.
Exactly. And he really is. And so when I introduce people to Paul's letters, what I usually do is I introduce them to the introductions of every one of Paul's letters.
Yeah.
Because he does it the exact same way every time. Well, almost every time. He does it in the way that you would expect a letter or a speech to start. Mm-hmm. It starts with a greeting, and then it tells you who he's writing to.
Kind of like a basic template to some degree.
Paul has a basic template. Mm-hmm. Paul has a basic template. And the only time he violates that template is to make a point. And so like, can I just go into one real quick?
Yeah, cool? Go for it.
Okay, cool. So if you read Philippians, the intro, so what happens is there's a salutation. There's like a greetings, everyone. And then from there, there's a prayer. And the prayer usually says in it what he wants to talk about because it's a speech, right? And what did we learn from speech class? If you took speech class, you learn, tell them what you're going to tell them and then tell them.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so the prayer usually contains the content he's going to present, right? And Paul usually addresses himself in a specific way in the way he wants to be seen, right? Mm-hmm. Like he may say, grace and peace to you from Paul, servant of the Lord. And that one, he's not claiming a lot of authority, right?
Yeah.
In other letters, he might say, grace and peace to you from Paul, the apostle taught by Peter.
Okay. Giving more credibility. Yeah.
It's the equivalent of you putting all your titles at the end of your email. You know, it's just
that's how you know you mean business.
That's exactly right. And he does that. And sometimes, so like when you read the Philippian introduction, it goes like this. Paul and Timothy, servants of Christ Jesus, to all the saints of Christ Jesus who are in Philippi, with the bishops and the deacons, grace to you and peace from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
Nice, right?
Nice, simple, sweet.
Check out the Galatian intro. Now keep in mind, sometimes we pronounce our values. I'm just a servant of the Lord here, guys. I'm just your Mr. Rogers here to talk to you about some Jesus. That's why I'm here. I'm so glad to be here with you. Now check out his Galatian intro, okay? So we just got out of I'm a servant of the Lord. Now we got Galatians. Paul, an apostle, sent neither by human commission nor the human authorities, but through Jesus Christ and God the Father, who raised him from the dead, and all the members of God's family who are with me.
Wow. We went from like this humble dude that's like the peace sign, y'all, into listen.
Exactly. And so when I teach people how to read Paul, and really it's not that I'm some kind of expert on the Bible, it's that really, really smart people showed me these templates. Mm-hmm. I was like, oh man, more people need to know about this. That's the only reason I do this, is because it's so important to me that other people have access to this information.
Yeah. Yeah,
And so,
honestly, I would never have even like compared that, like, because like you said in the beginning, like we tend to just kind of speed through it, or almost like we have those blinders on. It's like, okay, I just need to just read. That's all I've got to do. But when comparing intros, like I would just never have even looked at that, never even thought to look at that, because um it sometimes the Bible, especially King James, feels like it's just so high language that we can kind of miss that. And so comparing those two and saying, yeah, you're right, this one is more humble versus this one is like, let's get down to business. And I just never would have looked at that.
yeah, I mean, everyone has their favorite translation, I guess, but the Bible was written to be understood,
Mm-hmm.
not to be lofty. Now, granted, even Peter in the Bible says that Paul writes in a confusing way. So,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, so even Paul's confusing for the sake in as far as the Bible's concerned, apparently. But
Yeah. Well, I mean,
um,
Paul, I mean, he was highly educated too in
yeah,
comparison to the broader people. Like, you've got a lot of the apostles were like fishermen and just laborers that didn't have
mhm,
a reason to learn how to read or write. And then you've got
right.
Paul, who was like high up in government, and he's now writing to everybody. So I mean, I can see why they would say, "Hey, you're really hard to read for us because we just don't really read anyway." So
Exactly, exactly. So I guess it'd be more like he'd be hard to understand.
yeah,
He wouldn't be hard to read because no one could read. He'd be hard to
yeah,
understand. That makes more sense now that I think about it.
yeah.
But yeah, so like so when you read Paul, what you read is Paul's formula and how he deviates from that formula and
Mhm.
what that has to do. Now there's other stuff with context with Paul, but the starting point is understanding there's a template. It's a speech template, and he uses that to his advantage in every single letter.
Yeah. So I think that's definitely a good starting point with trying to start with this. So um if you want, I mean, moving into like where we wanted to talk about kind of like that inclusion aspect of things, like what would you point to show that Paul is inclusive, whether that's maybe LGBTQ plus inclusive. We mentioned women's ministry, like what
Mhm.
what verses would you point to that kind of backs up that theory?
Yeah, my go-to would have to be Romans 14 and 15. It's long. We could probably do a whole podcast on it.
Probably,
But
maybe
I'd go
next
to
time.
maybe next time. Hey, if you'll have me back, I'd love to do this again. But um, I'd pick Romans 14 and 15. And really, Romans 14 and 15 isn't anybody's memory verse as a kid. It's kind of overlooked. Like I've never talked to someone about Romans 14 and 15 who goes, yeah, I remember that. I read it yesterday. Nobody seems to know this text. But in that text, he says that nothing is unclean. If it is clean for you, it's clean. Your job is to live faithfully to God and do whatever you think is faithful. And whatever is done out of faith, without faith, is sinful. So if you don't think it's faithful, then don't do it. But if you think it's faithful, do it.
Hmm.
and and he's addressing a kind of cosmopolitan church, because the Roman church is made from a lot of Hellenistic people that converted to Christianity, and some of them swung the pendulum the far way and ended up being really really conservative theologically speaking,
Yeah.
right? And then he's dealing with a lot of former Jews who have converted to Christianity and swung the opposite direction, who have become very very liberal
Hmm.
theologically speaking. He's also dealing with Hellenists that have stayed liberal after becoming Christians and Jews that have stayed conservative after becoming Christians. And so what he's dealing with is this conservative liberal theological divide all throughout Romans.
Yeah, and I mean, this kind of brings us to the topic that we were addressing early on before the podcast started, is where there was this big divide between Peter and Paul over the Gentiles becoming
Mm-hmm.
circumcised and all of that. So, do you want to talk a little bit about that and kind of how that can maybe correlate to everything?
Yeah. So if you're going to start with Paul's ministry of inclusion, you have to start with where his ministry kind of kickstarted. You have to start with
Okay.
the Church of Antioch. So the Church of Antioch came to exist because the church in Jerusalem was getting so big so fast
Hmm.
that this is in Acts 11, I
Yeah,
think
when
it's
it
in
all
Acts
kind of,
11.
yeah.
Yeah, where everything just all spread apart.
Yeah, right.
So So basically, it was like a house party where the police show up and everyone scatters. So
That's a good descriptor.
it's a nice visual. You might hear some like Benny Hill music or something. It's great. So Acts 11 happens, and the Church of Jerusalem scatters, and these missionaries, because they all consider themselves as Christians people on mission, and they end up going to all over, including these guys from Cyprus and Cyrene or Cyrene, however you choose to pronounce it, ended up in this place called Antioch. And in Antioch, they started preaching to the Greeks. Now, that's a little controversial because if you read most of the Gospels, you hear Jesus say he's here for the Jews first. It's like, this is about the Jews. This is about the OG God Squad. This is about the people that have always been there. These are my people, minus, Melchizedek, and, deal with that on your own time. But that was a joke for all of us that went to vacation Bible school. And so I'm sorry. I just started riffing. My bad.
No, you're good. That'll be one of those like segments that I'll just like post randomly in places on like Instagram or something.
Do it. I'm thrilled. I love that you can have OG God Squad and Melchizedek and Vacation Bible School in the same clip. I think that's important.
Yes.
Okay, but basically, there's this for us who at any point have felt excluded from the church. There's this notion that we get from the Gospels that it's been about one group of people. It's always been about that one group of people, and it still is just about that one group of people, but with a new title. Yeah. That it's all about them and it's not about us. Paul's ministry changed that. Paul's ministry, starting in Antioch. So what happened is Barnabas went and got Paul basically out of his mom's basement in Tarsus. Love to talk about that sometime. Oh my gosh. If you ever feel like a failure, check out Paul's first two ministries. He was awful at it. He was so bad that I think I made a note of it somewhere because I need notes. Otherwise, I'll never
We're
shut
all
up.
about tangents. It's okay.
I'm thrilled. Okay, so Acts 9, the end of Acts 9, Paul gets run out of the city because not once but twice he's about to get killed by like the city because he's just such an aggressive preacher. And so they throw him out of the city and send him back to his mom's basement in Tarsus. And then there's this nice little verse at the end of chapter 9. I believe it's chapter 9. Don't like at me if I get that wrong. Just whatever. But,
how dare you?
It's the beginning of chapter 10. What were you thinking?
Yeah.
No, but
I got the glasses for you. It's fine.
Oh, thanks. You nailed it. I appreciate that. But no, it's at the end of chapter 9, it said, and after Paul left, the church finally experienced a great growth and a time of peace.
Wow. I mean, for a lot of us, like just reading over that, it's like you would never even have put that he was just like totally like mob just grabbed him and just kicked him out of the whole city just because he was just such a bad preacher.
Yeah, well, basically the apostles were together and they're like, all right, what are we going to, okay, we're going to send him to this other city. And then we'll eventually
how can we get rid of him?
It's just, and so it was only later that Barnabas went to go grab Paul from Tarsus. He was still called Saul at the time because the Bible wants us to be confused. That's not true. I just wanted to say that. So he grabs up Saul from Tarsus and brings him to this new church that has been planted by these people from Cyprus and Cyrene in Antioch. And so Barnabas and Paul spend a year in Antioch doing ministry in this Greek context, in this new context. And it's Paul's ministry with the Greeks that ends up butting up against Peter's ministry to the OG God Squad, to the Jews. Peter does this big turn where he's really conservative theologically at one point, where he's like, it's Jesus, but only Jews are with Jesus. This is us. This is the whole conversation. And there's this other conversation over here where Paul basically gets brought up in this more inclusive context, a context where the church is founded by Greek mission. And this church is actually the first church where people are called the Christians. Actually, the Church of Antioch has a lot of firsts, though. This is the first church fight between Peter and Paul about, eating with uncircumcised people and being with uncircumcised people, which is kind of the way that the Gentiles or the non-Jews are talked about. Whenever you read Gentile in the Bible, you should read the other.
Like
those that
Jews thought that didn't they used to think of them as more of like abominations, like unclean,
oh
to be
yeah,
around. Yeah.
absolutely. In fact, like not just unclean, the Samaritans, we've encountered the Samaritans. If you read the Bible, you've heard about Good Samaritan, you've heard
Yeah.
about the Samaritans. If you know about the Samaritan's purse, like the Samaritans, a big deal. Samaritans were basically half-breed Jews.
Ah.
That's the reason they were so controversial. They were biracial, bicultural,
Yeah.
and so like that whenever we read the assertion that a Samaritan can be a good person, we should kind of feel that 1950s, 60s American energy of like a biracial kid being held equal to a white kid. It is inherently racial. It is inherently political. It is tied to controversy that had to go back all the way to the Assyrians.
Mm-hmm.
So like racial issues are an underpinning of the entire biblical narrative, and racial reconciliation is the underpinning of the mission of the Gospel of Paul.
That kind of sums up like the inclusion ministry kind of in and of itself, because we're dealing with the whole cultural racial divide, religious divide, even among the other apostles, the whole woman who was wanting help, and they're just like, why are you bothering us? She's like, at least even dogs eat the scraps, that
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
so we all know that story. And so I think that the sad part is that whenever we're talking about biblical stuff in regards to racism and sexism and all that other stuff, it's like we don't
and
want to focus on
homophobia
that.
and transphobia and all these different conversations, right? We pretend that's not in the Bible, don't
Yeah.
we?
Like everybody's perfect. Paul's perfect. Just David. Everybody's perfect, and nobody
Oh
wants to
yeah,
talk
David's
about
a
it. Yeah.
sweetheart. He has zero political
Cough,
controversies.
cough,
What
Bathsheba. It's fine.
whether and let's not even mention that all these people that he happened to have problems with get struck dead at some point.
Hmm.
That's a whole nother episode.
Yeah.
Hitman David. I get to name that one. But no. So, so racial inclusion. We're familiar with that. We don't think it's a radical ideal. We don't really think about Paul as being woman inclusive or like in any way a feminist voice, usually a chauvinist voice. Before his time, he actually very much was an equal voice or a voice of equal trajectory. Can I talk about trajectory hermeneutics for a second?
Yeah, absolutely. And I will say, we're recording, we're almost at the 40-minute mark. So if we
Oh my
have
goodness.
to, yeah, I know. If we have to, we'll do a part 2 and just like we'll stop and then we'll just go right into it in the next one. But
Okay, well, then I'll talk about this first.
Okay, cool.
So the Church of Antioch, just go back to Church of Antioch for a second. The Church of Antioch is a church of a lot of firsts, and it is the first church to look at a need for missions and send missionaries to go do something. It's the first.
Yeah.
The first of its kind. Yeah, basically there's a bunch of them. I think it's in Acts chapter, what is it, 13? Yeah, Acts 13. There's this big prayer at the beginning of 13. There's about 5 people present at this prayer. And they're kind of diverse themselves. They're pretty diverse, these 5 people. And 2 of them are Paul, or Saul of Tarsus, and Barnabas. And in this prayer, they hear from the Holy Spirit who says, I want you to send Paul, and I want you to send Barnabas. And so they're the first 2 missionaries sent to plant a church ever. So this is a big deal.
Yeah.
And so when we read Paul, we need to be aware this guy, after failing at ministry, was raised up in a ministry that was built upon racial inclusion. He was built in a ministry that dealt with worldviews and people that felt othered. And he was dealing with being raised up in that context. And so that is the springboard that launches the ministry of Paul, the author of the majority of the New Testament.
Wow. And that's profound. That speaks to, because I think we talked about this obviously off podcast, off camera, but about how I have such a love-hate relationship with anything to do with Paul, just because of how you're brought up saying, well, Paul hates this and hates this and hates this, and he's kind of washed in this prejudice, hatred mentality where, looking at it from an eye of, first of all, we got to look at the context, the social norm at the time. He was
Right.
super, super radical for what he was doing. I mean, just like Jesus, he was super radical for what he was doing. And then we've got Paul coming in and making these huge sweeping changes that, yes, looking backward from where we're at now, yeah, maybe he wasn't as progressive as we would like it to be. But I mean, for what he was doing and what he was dealing with at the time, it was crazy. And no wonder, he had a mob. Well, I mean, obviously he was a bad preacher to begin with, but I mean, no wonder that he ended up getting arrested and more times than not. So, I mean, it's definitely, I mean, I'm glad you brought it up. So,
Well, I mean, I'm happy to. It's just what we need to be aware of is the historical change makers are always less radical than we are.
Of course, yeah.
And we're okay with that with other people, but we're not okay with that when it comes to the Bible, because we don't think about them as change makers because we're raised in this new context.
Mm-hmm.
But Paul is a change maker. He changed the way that women get treated for the better from where they were being treated, and he set a trajectory. Like he pointed his finger, going, "We're going to go that way," and the that way is the way that we want to go too, and the way that we have gone as people. Like the that away that Paul does, which is usually called trajectory hermeneutics, is something that would have been radical for his time and is the bedrock for a lot of our more feminist theologies, and is the bedrock for a lot of our more pro-rights theologies, especially freeing of slaves. Like there wouldn't be a freeing of slaves theology baseline without the writings of Paul. You could make some arguments for Jesus as well, don't get me wrong, but you get it from Paul.
Yeah, I mean, Paul without Paul, like you were saying, we wouldn't really have the theology or anything that we have now. I mean, the majority of churches and Christian mainstream is pretty much entirely based off of Paul's theology that he created.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And so that's the reason I think it's so important to learn how to read them. Because I don't think we have a problem in the world with bad Christians. I think we have a problem in the world with illiterate Bible readers.
That's profound.
I just think it's true.
Yeah.
And I think if we reteach how to read Paul, people can come to their own conclusions, and they'll realize really quickly, this guy has a radically inclusive message. And if I tap into that inclusion, we're going to find something new. And so, like, if you read Romans 14, you find a text of moral ambiguity and talking about the moral gray areas and why it's important. And when you read that his mission is for the Gentiles, that change, realizing that means it's for the other. Paul's ministry was built upon and was set out because he was the missionary for the other.
Yeah.
And that's our framework.
I think honestly that if we're going to end it anything on there, I think that would be a good statement. It's just to end it on that one. I mean, that put it all together.
Well, I mean, this was, Alex, I really appreciate you having me. This has been a lot of fun. 40 minutes went by very fast.
Yeah, I know.
And we should definitely do this again sometime.
Thank you for listening to our podcast here at Queer Christian Family Values. If you'd like to support us in what we do, then check us out on patreon.com/QCFV and become a supporter as low as $1 a month. All proceeds go to our ministry. And with that, thank you for listening.